Hi, this is John Harter, and welcome to episode 46 of Keep On Grooving. We'll pick up where we left off a few months back and deal with the second part of the Experience's 1969 schedule, from several not-so-productive recording sessions in New York to a series of concerts across the country that belied the band's dissolving relationship. Episode 46, the Jimi Hendrix Experience U.S. Tour, April-May 1969. Okay, before we start, a Keep On Grooving update. The long gestating Electric Lady Studio box set has now been set for September 13th release date. We'll talk more about that at the end of next episode. Heads up, we'll be doing a lot with this set. So let's just quick sum up where we were in the first part of 1969. The Experience did a tour of Europe that concluded at Royal Albert Hall with a couple of concerts that were recorded and filmed for later use, and we're still waiting for that later use. They took some time off in March, but Jimi did some recording with some other musicians to try to re-inspire his seeming lack of production. Lots of cool jams, but very few things that could be considered a finished song. So once again, I'll be using Ultimate Hendrix as a guide. There have been other books put out since then, including a well-regarded set of day-by-day books. Fortunately, they're a little expensive, and I haven't been able to pick them up yet. So, gotta go with the hand you're dealt. On April 1st, Jimi, Mitch, and Noel met at Olmsted Studios rather than their usual record plant haunt to see if a new venue would help get things going. Though Eddie Kramer was officially attached to the record plant, he came by to help out and see what he could do. The studio was mainly used for jazz artists, so there was a very different vibe there. No matter, the band made their own vibe and continued their partying ways. When they did actually record, they focused on a few things. The first was an instrumental tentatively called Midnight Lightning, but later shortened to Midnight. It was an instrumental, but not an out-and-out jam. It was fairly structured with a number of different movements and a second rhythm guitar. They recorded a number of takes, but nothing was done with it while Jimi was alive. After his passing and the initial round of albums, Cry of Love, Rainbow Bridge, and In the West, once Eddie was sent to find some more material to release, this was one of the tracks he selected for use on what would become War Heroes. The original take was around 8.5 minutes. Eddie and John Jansen cut it down to about 5.5 and added a number of effects for its 1972 debut. When Alan Douglas reused the track for 1995's Voodoo Soup, he stripped out most of those effects but added 30 seconds back in and mixed the second guitar up a little bit. That iteration lasted 2 years before it was yanked and replaced by the War Heroes version's reappearance on 1997's South Saturn Delta. The other song worked on that day was Bleeding Heart. It began to work its way into the band's repertoire at Royal Albert Hall. This night, they tried to rev up the arrangement a little bit, moving towards the version that would be done in 1970 and open up War Heroes as the first track. I don't believe this version has leaked out anywhere. Recordings the next day were done for Midnight and Hear My Train A-Comin', but again, nothing was finished or has leaked out. On April 3rd, the band returned once more to Midnight, but it ended up changing a little bit along the way. One take ended up interpolating some bits from Piece of Mississippi, the jam they did back at TTG Studios in LA in October 1968. Take 6 started, but the microphone on Mitch's snare drum malfunctioned and gave it a very different sound. Noel decided to use his 8-string bass again, so between those two unique sounds, the song started the same as Midnight, but ended up going off on its own direction. While this was also never used during Hendrix's lifetime, someone along the way decided to label this particular take Trash Man. This track became the opener for 1975's Midnight Lightning. Of course, the original backing track was removed, therefore negating the Trash Can Man reference, and it was cut down from 7.5 minutes to around 3. But at least people got to hear a different version of a song they knew from a few years before. We finally got to hear the song as it was supposed to sound on the Dagger release Hear My Music in 2004. Plus, it was a bonus track on some versions of Valleys of Neptune. I think from like Target. On April 4th, they decided to try to refine the Trash Man version of the Midnight theme. They also started to work out what will become Crash Landing a few weeks later, of course, without the Experience. These recordings haven't leaked either, as far as I've heard. On the 5th, they decided enough was enough with Olmsted and went back to the record plant. They began working on a song called Ships Passing in the Night. This would morph into something else. More on this in a bit. On April 6th, Jimi did some recording with an electric guitar. Might be interesting to hear at least a snippet of this, but again, I don't think it's been leaked. Otherwise, it was more work on Ships and some on the early version of Easy Rider. On the 7th, the band recorded 3 songs that all ended up being released. Of course, all posthumously. The first track was another stab at Hear My Train A-Comin'. This may have shown how out of touch they were with their material, or how having a hand like Chas Chandler would have been able to help. One of the takes has surfaced over the years, first as a track on Midnight Lightning. This was one of the few tracks on Midnight Lightning, and Crash Landing for that matter, that had the original musicians still on it, at least one. Mitch's drum track was kept, while Noel's bass line was replaced by Bob Babbitt. Now, Bob's an amazing bassist, but my issue with his work on this song is he played an interesting bass line, but it wasn't the bass line to Hear My Train A-Comin'. It would be like hearing a different bass part to Whipping Post or Free Will or Silly Love Songs. Yeah, it's not the same song without it. Luckily, we did get to hear the Experience's original version on Valleys of Neptune. I'm not sure if the spoken word intro from Midnight Lightning is from a different take and added in by Alan. It actually would have worked well here. But overall, this is as solid a take the band had done probably since Look Over Yonder from TTG, or even Come On from the Electric Ladyland sessions. If you were to ask me what a studio take of Hear My Train A-Comin' would sound like, I'd point to this one in a heartbeat. It may not have an amazing solo like some of the live versions, but one could have been overdubbed later. But there wasn't anyone there to tell Jimi, I think you got this one. So it sat in the vaults. If I were putting together any overarching posthumous collections, such as trying to do a 3-album People, Hell, and Angels like he thought about at one point, I'd pick this track without hesitation. It might have also helped him not do the next song, Stone Free. Yes, that Stone Free. Whether this means Jimi was so bereft of new material he redid his first song, or if he actually wanted to try to improve it, we don't know. But the basic track is very solid and set aside for further work. The session ended with Lullaby for the Summer, an evolution of the Touch You riff that worked its way into Easy Rider. After 7 straight days of work, they took the 8th off and went back in on the 9th. Jimi overdubbed a new solo for the Stone Free remake. Then they spent more time on Hear My Train A-Comin'. One of these later takes was released on Both Sides of the Sky in 2018. It's along the lines of the one a few days earlier, but you have to wonder what the mood was like in the studio. The guitar tone for this song is hot. Maybe too hot. The fuzz from it almost obscures the playing to some extent. But it was certainly worth taking a look at, though I have to wonder if Eddie wasn't able to do anything with it when it made it out on both sides. This take would make a later appearance, or almost made an appearance that ended up being booted. We'll talk about that when we get to another studio take of the song next episode. Then it was time to hit the road in the U.S. again for the first time since late 1968. They started in Raleigh, North Carolina. There doesn't appear to be a recording for this show anywhere that I could find. Now, there is a set list that was on one page of the book and migrated over to setlist.com. There are several red flags, however. The set started with Stone Free, which may have been on his mind since he just recorded it. Then it went through a number of his usual songs, Hear My Train A-Comin', Fire, Red House, Purple Haze, a little early for this, and Foxy Lady. Then the set list has Little Miss Strange, which is not on the other page. I'm highly skeptical of this. There's no evidence I've heard or seen that either of Noel's songs ever got played live. So let's put this one with a question mark next to it. Then Hey Joe is on both lists, as well as Third Stone from the Sun. Was not played very often. Maybe it wasn't the whole song, but a snippet. It does appear on both lists, so something that sounded like Third Stone was probably played. Setlist.com then has Are You Experienced? Again, it wasn't played often at this point, but not out of the question. Manic Depression was next, even rare, but still possible, though not really heard of since Winterland. And All Along the Watchtower, which isn't known to have been played by the Experience in the US at all. The set ends with the Star Spangled Banner. Neither site lists the usual closer, Voodoo Child. So, who knows what that actually was. The next night, the band played the Spectrum in Philadelphia, and this does have an audience recording out there. The concert started with fire, but it's not on any of the audience tapes that I checked out. They all pick up in the middle of the first verse of Red House. Extrapolating it out, it probably would have been the same length as Royal Albert Hall and some of the later ones. Foxy Lady followed a mid-paced version. I Don't Live Today is next with a pretty cool solo section before the usual chaotic ending. Hear My Train a Comin' exists in only about a minute due to a tape cutout. Then came Stone Free, again, must have been fresh on his mind from the recent recording. This was a little more stretched out, kind of like the Royal Albert Hall version. The usual finale of Star Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child ended the show. After taking Sunday off, the band went back into the studio on the 14th. The main work done was finishing up overdubs on the new version of Stone Free. The guitar solo and backing vocals were done here. The band was joined on said backing vocals by Roger Chapman and Andy Fairweather Lowe, who had an extensive career as a studio musician as well as a backup guitar for people like Eric Clapton. Now, this recording was made somewhat superfluous by Reprise's release of the original version on their version of Smash Hits the following June. In 1975, Alan Douglas replaced the backing instruments with Jeff Mironoff, Bob Babbitt, and Alan Schwartzberg, but left the backing vocals on. It ended up on side 2 of Crash Landing under the name Stone Free again. The original recording got released in 2000 on the Purple Box. We'll see this recording, or at least pieces of it, one more time. We'll get to it towards the end of the episode. After that, Jimi returned to Ships Passing in the Night, taking a more blues-based approach. One of these takes was released on Valleys of Neptune. Then there's a whole lot of jamming, including a couple of run-throughs of Sunshine of Your Love. I don't believe any of these have been circulated. Then next, we have Buddy Miles and keyboardist Larry Young dropping by for some more jamming. One of the later takes included jazz bassist Dave Holland, went on for over 20 minutes. This take was edited down to half its length and put out as Young Hendrix on 1980's Nine to the Universe. The full take made it out on 2010's West Coast Seattle Boy box set. Jimi didn't return to the studio until Thursday the 17th. Before that, he had a meeting about the plans for his upcoming studio. I'm going to hold off talking about this for now. We will deal with it when we deal with the box set, since this is basically what that set is about, so we'll just do everything together. That night, he tried to work Lullaby for the Summer into Easy Rider, but it didn't take just yet. After that, there was a lot of jamming, including a wild take of Keep On Grooving, at least John McDermott thinks so, and Ultimate Hendrix. Again, don't think I've heard of any of these being out there, so can we get another Dagger release for this? But anyway, with that, the Jimi Hendrix Experience's studio career came to an ignoble close. Now, speaking of the upcoming studio, the band had a full weekend of concerts set to help pay for its construction. Friday night, the Experience did 2 shows in Memphis. Despite the music they had been making both on the road and in the studio, the relationship between Jimi and Noel had begun to fray again. So much so that Jimi decided to put into a call to his old army buddy, Billy Cox, who was still in Nashville. Billy came and the two talked for a bit. Jimi ended up asking him to come to New York City. Cox agreed, and by Monday, he was in New York. More on this in a bit, even though we've already covered it. Now for the show. I haven't seen a first set list out there. The second set was recorded, and it was very similar to the Spectrum show the weekend before. The tape starts off with fire a little bit into the first verse. I Don't Live Today is a very solid version that stretches out at the end quite a bit. Hear My Train a Comin' is also very solid. Sunshine of Your Love has Jimi on the wah-wah scratching through Noel's bass solo. Wonder if Isaac Hayes was there listening to him. The end fades out and then comes back in mid-first verse of Stone Free, which is pretty compact. Then we get the traditional closing sequence of Foxy Lady in the not quite fast but definitely not slow version, Star Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child in another pretty compact version. The audience was pretty noisy right around the taper, though one guy had a good idea calling out for crosstown traffic. Too bad they never did it. Now, I wonder if Red House was in the first set, it was conspicuously missing in the second. The band traveled to Texas for a couple of shows. Saturday was in Houston. There's not a full recording out there and just a partial set list. Fire, Foxy Lady, Purple Haze, Sunshine of Your Love, and Voodoo Child. The tape floating around that there has the last 2 songs, and if there's not an edit in Voodoo Child, it's among the shortest versions since the song got added to the set in mid-1968. Then Sunday night, then we're in Dallas. We have an almost full recording of the show, and it's again very similar to the last 2 fully recorded shows. Stone Free again comes in after the first verse and stretches out for a little bit, almost like 6 minutes. Hear My Train a Comin' has another solid outing. Foxy Lady in the not quite slow but definitely not fast version. I Don't Live Today goes right into Fire. Red House, which picks up a little bit of the opening, then cuts out at the second verse. It picks up mid-solo. That's taping in those days. Star Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child, which picks up a little after the intro, so a bit of a choppy tape there. Now, for Billy Cox's trip to New York and that whole week that included the recording with the Cherry People and concerts in LA and Oakland, both of which have been released, you can go ahead and stop this episode here and go have a listen to episode 27 from November of 2022. Wow, that long. Wow. You can either find it in podcast form or you can go to YouTube and find the video. Go ahead. I'll wait until you're back. All done? Okay, now on to a very consequential couple of days, ones that would affect the rest of the year. It doesn't appear Jimi did too much after the Oakland show until May 2nd. The band made it to Detroit for a show at the legendary Cobo Hall, one that would become well known in the 70s on such live albums as Bob Seger's Live Bullet and Kisses Alive. Doesn't look like there's a recording out there. The set list mixes things up a little bit, depending on where you see it. In Ultimate Hendrix, it's Fire, Spanish Castle Magic, Foxy Lady, I Don't Live Today, Sunshine of Your Love, Voodoo Child, and Red House. On setlist.com, the first 3 are the same. Then it goes to Johnny B. Good, followed by Red House and the usual closers, Star Spangled Banner, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child. Somewhere in there, the truth lies. The next morning, the band took a short flight from Detroit to Toronto. As they went through customs, something was found in one of Jimi's bags, some kind of powder. He was detained, and tests showed it to be heroin. He was then arrested, taken downtown, and later released on $10,000 bail to make the concert that night. Now, Jimi had been known to do heroin. The question is, would he have been so irresponsible to have packed it in his bags while going across international borders? There were stories that maybe Mike Jeffrey had planted it. But that doesn't make any sense to me. They needed the money to continue the construction of the studio and to pay back the loans, and Jimi wouldn't make any money sitting in jail. Now, surprisingly, after all that, the show was among the better ones on this part of the tour. It opened with an expansive Fire and a fierce Hear My Train a-Comin'. Then during an extended Spanish Castle Magic, they went into a jam section that included a snippet of Third Stump from the Sun and the whole Little Miss Lover. I don't know if they had done that since the BBC sessions. Mitch's drum solo in the middle of the song involved into the opening of Little Miss Lover, so I guess Jimi just picked up on it. Then it was on to Red House, the tapes missing the beginning of the opening, and a moderately paced Foxy Lady before he went off into another jam, this time sort of based around Room Full of Mirrors, a la Royal Hall, but including snippets from Crash Landing, Keep on Grooving, and Gypsy Eyes. This is a completely unique performance. Now this goes right into Purple Haze and Voodoo Child into the show. Talk about making lemonade out of lemons. The band could have fallen apart with everything going on, but they were in sync and put on an amazing show. They came back to the U.S. the next night for a show in Syracuse. Again, doesn't look like there's a recording for this. A partial set list in Ultimate Hendrix has Fire, I Don't Live Today, Stone Free, and Foxy Lady. Setlist.com has 15 songs listed, but there are so many questionable ones. Crash Landing and Keep on Grooving again? Room Full of Mirrors and Little Miss Lover again? I'm kind of dubious of its authenticity. Sounds like they got mixed up with the show from the night before, so let's just leave it as an open question. On somebody's first birthday, Jimi went back into the record plant and listened to the Winterland tapes for what appears to be the only time. It was over 6 months since they'd been recorded, so you'd have hoped Jimi would have been able to take a step back and hear the parts of the recordings that didn't have technical issues. Apparently it didn't go too well. After an hour and a half of putting together some rough mixes, Jimi left and the tapes were never touched again until 1982 in the Concerts album. I get why he didn't feel like paring down a long jam of Tax Free or something like that, but there were quite a number of gems in there, as we now know. On May 7th, Jimi had been hanging out at the Scene Club in the wee morning hours. Later, he ended up taking Billy Cox, Buddy Miles, Stephen Stills, and Johnny Winter back to the record plant for a long jam session. The three guitarists took turns trading licks on a Stills-led riff. Then Jimi brought them into Earth Blues. They slowed it down, and he led them into Ships Passing in the Night. A couple of efforts came apart, but Jimi decided to move them onto Guitar Slims, the things that I used to do. Now, the other songs that night, I don't think I've ever heard, but the last one has been around for quite a while. It officially appeared in the Live and Unreleased radio show, edited down from 7 minutes to around 5. It then got another release on Both Sides of the Sky, however, edited down to barely 3.5 minutes. Now, it's an open question as to who actually played on the track outside of Jimi and Johnny Winter. According to Both Sides, they have Mitch Mitchell on drums, but I'm not sure he was even there. Some sources had future CSN drummer Dallas Taylor behind the kit. Now, Both Sides doesn't list anyone on bass, and there's clearly one there. If I had to give an answer, I'd go with Billy, or maybe Stephen Stills, I don't know. And as far as the drums go, I'd say Buddy, unless I see something definitive like some kind of log sheet. That's the problem with these loose jams back then. On Thursday, May 8th, the band embarked on a 4-day swing through the South and Midwest. They started in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Roll Tide. It doesn't look like there's a set list anywhere for this. It's likely something along the lines of what appeared in the previous weekends. Next night, it was up to Charlotte, North Carolina. Again, doesn't appear to be a tape for this, but Ultimate Hendrix does have a set list. Outside of an unusual Johnny B. Good for an opener at this point, typical set: Fire, Spanish Castle Magic, Foxy Lady, Red House, Purple Haze, and Voodoo Child. Saturday the 10th found them in Charleston, West Virginia. Again, no tape and a partial set list. A very rare U.S. outing for Come On, Fire, Hear My Train A-Comin', Foxy Lady, Purple Haze, Voodoo Child. Setlist.com also has I Don't Live Today and Red House there, while Ultimate Hendrix has the show's finale listed as Wild Thing, which would have been a really rare outing at that point. Now for the weekend wrap-up in Indianapolis, we do have a tape for that one. Come On is again the opener, followed by Hey Joe, which hadn't heard much yet, Stone Free, Hear My Train A-Comin', Fire, Red House, Foxy Lady, and Voodoo Child. Yes, believe it or not, there was no Purple Haze. At least it's not on the tapes that are out there. After taking Monday off, Jimi went into the record plant to do some jamming and maybe do some solo demos. However, the jamming with an unknown group of musicians sort of meandered on, and the demos never really got going because of technical issues. On the 14th, Billy and Mitch joined Jimi in the studio, accompanied by piano player Sharon Lane. Jimi had come up with a new instrumental jam, and the band worked on that. They did 4 takes, with 2 and 4 being basically complete. Now, after this night, Jimi wouldn't return to them, but the song did make an appearance later on, or should I say, 2 appearances. When John Jansen was looking for material used for what would become Loose Ends, he came across the jam song from this session. With no notes on what the title was, it's assumed he just used what was on the tape box, Jam 292. He used about 3 minutes and 50 seconds of the nearly 5.5-minute jam. I get the fade out at the end where the song falls apart, but The song has a very unique intro. It's a shame it wasn't used then. Later, when Alan Douglas was looking for blues-type songs to use for the blues album, he decided to use take 2 and the whole 5.5 minutes of that. However, he decided to have a little fun and to differentiate it from the earlier version. He called this one Jelly 292. Get it? Jelly, jam. Yeah. When Experienced Hendrix reissued the album later, they changed the name back to Jam 292. They could have kept Jelly in like parentheses to tell the difference between the other one, but speaking of which, the full 525 version of Jam 292 finally was released on Hear My Music in 2004. On the 15th, Jimi did some more experimentation with different types of instrumentation. He brought in some horns, keyboards, electric guitar, and a lot of percussion. He started working on Power of Soul, which at that point he called With the Power of God. They did one take of Crash Landing with a bit of what would become Freedom in there, as well as more work on Ships Passing in the Night. But nothing approached anything like a finished track. Sharon didn't end up doing anything more with Jimi. According to Billy, she was uptight playing with the Jimi Hendrix. And kind of like with the guys from the Cherry People, I mean, who could blame them from going to little clubs to recording one of the biggest acts of the day? Another hectic weekend started out with the band's gig down in Baltimore. We have a tape for it. The set was very similar to Royal Albert Hall. It opens with Lover Man, more similar to the way he'd be doing it a year later, followed by Hear My Train A-Comin', An Enthusiastic Fire, Red House. I Don't Live Today has its opening cut and comes in somewhere in the first verse. Foxy Lady, Purple Haze, Spanish Castle Magic, and Voodoo Child, where the tape runs about 2 minutes into the final solo, but at least we got all the verses. It's a pretty rough audience tape, and rougher in its raw form. The people out there have cleaned it up a little bit, but overall a good show. Then as they were heading up to Rhode Island the next night, Jimi, Billy, and Mitch stopped by the record plant to do some recording. They ended up doing their own take of Stone Free, which was heavily based on the April redo, but had its own unique ending. The session had another purpose, to see how Billy and Mitch worked together. As the take showed, they did so pretty well. Now, you wouldn't think this take would have any use, but it did get an airing. Valleys of Neptune opens with this take of Stone Free with a twist. The version recorded on May 17th didn't have vocals or overdubs, so Eddie and his team did a little Pro Tools work, lifted the vocals and solo off of the Experience's April recording, and put them on the May take. I'm not sure this was really necessary. It probably should have been saved for the West Coast Seattle Boy box later that year, just without all the additions, so we can hear it fresh. Now with that, they headed up to Providence, and we have another tape. Lover Man, again. I Don't Live Today, Red House, Hear My Train A-Comin'. Wait, 2 blues in a row? Spanish Castle Magic that morphs into Sunshine of Your Love. Foxy Lady, which goes right into Purple Haze, which goes right into a quick Star Spangled Banner, played with his teeth, and Voodoo Child. Very nice tape for this show. The next night, it was back to New York and a show at Madison Square Garden. After a false start intro that ticks off the audience for a minute, they go into the fiercest Lover Man I think I've ever heard, a pretty wicked Come On, Red House that has to be pointed out to someone in the audience right near the taper, Fire, which halfway through turns into a drum solo, and when they pick it up again, it's Spanish Castle Magic, which also evolves into something like the Woodstock solo. It even breaks into Villanova Junction for a bit, which is one of the few times it was ever played live. Then it sounds like he's going to do Catfish Blues, but it becomes Hear My Train A-Comin'. I Don't Live Today follows with the Star Spangled Banner snippet at the end, like the show a week or so later that we've talked about, and we'll talk about again. Voodoo Child and Purple Haze finishes up with a wild ending like the old 67 and 68 shows. No Foxy Lady here, but overall, another strong show. The next time he was at Madison Square Garden, not so much. Okay, let's take a break here. We'll take care of the next 6 weeks next time. Not too much on the studio recording side, but a lot of concerts, including the last ones the Experience would ever do. One more quick thing before we go. John Mayall passed away last week at the age of 90. modern rock music would not have sounded the same without him. He was one of the driving forces behind the British blues movement in the early 60s, earning him the title, the Godfather of British Blues. Just look at who came through his band. Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, John McVie, Mick Fleetwood, Peter Green, our old buddy Ainsley Dunbar, Mick Taylor, the list goes on. He was actually performing just until recently, maybe a year or so ago. He left his mark on all of us. Rest in peace, John. Next episode, the experience comes to an end, but the band of Gypsies begins to form in the months of May and June 1969. That's next time on Keep On Grooving. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm John Hartraw. Thanks for listening.